The rain began the moment Hannah Fairweather stepped through the gates of Vane Hall, and she knew at once that nothing about this day would go as planned. She was already late. The cake balanced in her arms, wrapped in linen and tied with string, had taken her father 3 days to bake, and he had warned her twice not to let it tip. Her shoes sank into the gravel path, and somewhere behind the high stone walls a dog began to bark, sharp and sudden, making her heart jump. She had never been inside the grounds of a duke's house before. Her father usually made the deliveries himself, but his cough had worsened overnight, and there had been no one else to send. Hannah had pulled on her cloak, taken the cake from the cooling rack, and told herself it was only a short walk. She had not expected the walk to end at a gate so tall it blocked out half the sky. A steward met her at the servants' entrance, a narrow door tucked behind a hedge, and looked her over as though she had tracked mud through a church. "You are late," he said. "The dinner begins within the hour." "I am sorry, sir. My father is ill. I came as quickly as I could." The steward's mouth pressed into a thin line. He did not step aside. "This is not how deliveries are received here. You should have come to the kitchen door an hour ago," properly announced. "Wait here. I will see if the housekeeper has time for you." He turned and left her standing in the rain, the cake growing heavier in her arms with every passing minute. Water dripped from the edge of her hood and ran down the back of her neck. She shifted her weight, trying to keep the linen dry, and wondered if she ought to simply set the cake down on the step and walk home. Her father would be furious either way, she thought. Better furious than humiliated. She did not hear the door open again. She heard footsteps instead, quick and unhurried at once, the kind of walk that belonged to a man who had never needed to rush anywhere in his life. Is someone lost? Hannah turned, and found herself looking up into the face of a man she did not recognize, though something in his bearing told her exactly who he must be. He wore no coat, only a waistcoat of deep gray, as though he had stepped outside without thinking, and his dark hair was already damp from the rain. "I am delivering a cake, Your Grace," she said, because there was no one else it could be. "For tonight's dinner. My father was to bring it himself, but he is unwell." The Duke of Vane looked at her for a long moment, then at the parcel in her arms, soaked through at one corner where the rain had found a gap in the linen. "And they left you standing in the rain to explain yourself. It is not their fault. I was late. You are shivering." "I am quite well, sir." He did not appear to believe her. He held the door open with one hand and gestured for her to come inside, an act so plain and unremarkable that it took her a moment to understand what he meant. "Come in before you catch a chill. The cake can wait a moment longer than you have already made it wait." She hesitated only because she did not know the rules of a house like this, and feared breaking one before she had even crossed the threshold. But the rain was cold, and her arms ached, and there seemed no better option than to do as she was told. The hallway inside was warmer than anything she had felt all day, lit by candles set into the walls, and smelling faintly of beeswax and cut flowers. She stood dripping onto the stone floor, acutely aware of how out of place she looked, her plain wool cloak beside the polished wood and gilded frames. "I am sorry for the mess I am making," she said. "The floor has survived worse than rainwater. What is your name?" "Hannah, sir. Hannah Fairweather." "And the cake, Hannah Fairweather. Is it for my dinner tonight, or has some rival household paid you to poison me?" It took her a moment to realize he was teasing her. She almost smiled before she caught herself. "It is honey cake, sir, with lemon. My father's recipe. He has made it every year for your household's Michaelmas dinner, though I confess I do not know why this year fell to me. Because your father is unwell, and you did not wish to disappoint him." She looked up, surprised he had understood so quickly, and found him watching her with an expression she could not name. Not the polite distance she expected from a man of his rank, but something more curious, more attentive, as though she were a puzzle he had not expected to find on his doorstep. The steward appeared again, flustered at finding her inside rather than outside where he had left her, and began at once to apologize to the Duke for the delay, casting Hannah a look that suggested the fault was entirely hers. "Take the cake to the kitchen," the Duke said, cutting him off before the apology could finish. "And bring a plate for Miss Fairweather. She will be staying for dinner." The steward's face went through several expressions in quick succession, none of which he dared voice aloud. "Your Grace," she said quickly. "I could not possibly. I am not dressed for it. I have not been invited. My father will wonder where I have gone." "You have been invited now," he said simply. "And as for your father, I will send word that you are delayed by the weather and by my own poor manners in keeping you. It is the least I owe you, for making you stand outside my own house in the rain." It was not a request, though he had made it sound like one, gentle enough that refusing felt almost rude. Hannah looked down at her plain gray dress, damp at the hem, and then up at the vast staircase behind him, and could not imagine how she had come to be standing here at all. "I have never dined in a house like this," she admitted. "I would not know which fork to use." "Then I will tell you," he said, and for the first time she saw something close to a smile at the corner of his mouth. "It is not so complicated as people make it seem. Mostly it is a matter of not stabbing your neighbor." Despite herself, she laughed, a short, surprised sound that echoed oddly in the grand hallway. The steward looked scandalized. The Duke did not. "Come," he said. "The others will already be seated, and I find I would rather explain your presence to them than send you home hungry and soaked to the skin. It seems the smaller crime." She followed him down the hallway, her wet shoes squeaking faintly against the stone, her mind racing through every possible way this evening could go wrong. She thought of her father, waiting at home with his cough and his worry, and wondered what he would say if he could see her now, walking beside a duke as though she belonged there. She did not belong there. She knew that plainly enough. But he had asked, and something about the asking had felt like more than kindness. It had felt, strange as it was to admit even to herself, like the beginning of something she had no name for yet. At the door to the dining room he paused and looked at her once more, as if to be certain she had not changed her mind. "Are you ready, Miss Fairweather?" "No," she said honestly, "but I do not think that has ever stopped anyone from walking through a door before." He laughed at that, a real laugh, quick and unguarded, and for a moment, the distance between a duke and a baker's daughter seemed to close by some small but definite measure. Then he opened the door, and the warmth and light and noise of the dinner spilled out to meet them. The room beyond was larger than any Hannah had ever stood in. A long table stretched almost the length of it, set with silver that caught the candlelight and sent it scattering across the walls. A dozen guests sat already, their conversation pausing as the door opened, their eyes moving first to the Duke and then, with visible surprise, to the damp and plainly dressed young woman beside him. "Forgive the delay," the Duke said, his voice carrying easily over the hush that had fallen. "We were caught by the rain. This is Miss Fairweather, who has kindly agreed to join us this evening." No one asked why a baker's daughter had been invited to sit among them, though Hannah could feel the question in every glance sent her way. A footman pulled out a chair beside the Duke's own place at the head of the table, and she lowered herself into it with as much composure as she could manage, aware of her damp hem, her plain hands, the absence of any jewel or fine fabric to mark her as belonging there. An older woman across the table, dressed in deep violet with silver at her throat, studied Hannah with open curiosity rather than scorn. "You must be freezing, my dear," she said. "Shall I have someone fetch a shawl?" "I am quite comfortable, thank you," Hannah managed, though her hands were still cold beneath the table. The Duke signaled to a servant regardless, and within minutes a warm shawl was draped gently over her shoulders. She caught his eye as it happened, and saw no triumph there, no satisfaction at having proven a point, only the plain and simple wish that she not be cold in his house. Conversation resumed slowly around the table, careful at first, testing the strangeness of her presence, then gradually easing into its usual rhythm of politics and weather, and the price of wool. Hannah said little, watching the movements of the guests around her, learning by observation which fork accompanied which course, grateful when the Duke leaned slightly toward her once or twice to murmur a quiet word of guidance without drawing attention to the lesson. "You are managing very well," he said quietly, during a lull, for someone who claimed she did not know which fork to use. "I am simply copying you, sir. If you reach for the wrong one, I shall know exactly where the blame lies." "Then I had better be careful," he said, and there was that small smile again, there and gone before anyone else could notice it. A man seated further down the table, sharp-featured and watchful, asked pointedly how the Duke had come to know a baker's family so well. The Duke answered smoothly, something about tradition and Michaelmas and years of loyal service, but Hannah noticed the way the man's gaze lingered on her afterward, assessing, unreadable, as though filing the information away for later use. She did not know his name yet. She would learn it soon enough, and come to wish she never had. When at last the honey cake was brought out, carried in with more ceremony than Hannah had ever imagined a simple dessert could receive, she felt an odd flush of pride beneath her nervousness. The guests praised it generously, and the Duke took a second slice, declaring it the finest thing he had eaten all season, loud enough for the whole table to hear. "Your father is a talented man," he said to her. "You must thank him for me, once he is well again." "I will tell him," she said, "though I do not think he will believe me, when I explain the whole of how his cake was received tonight. Tell him whatever version you like. I only ask that you leave out the part where my steward left you standing in the rain." She smiled, and for the length of that dinner, in the warmth of candlelight and good company, she almost forgot that she did not belong in a room like this at all. By the time the meal ended and the guests began to rise, the rain outside had softened to a light patter against the windows. The Duke walked with her to the door himself, waving away the steward who moved to intervene, and stood with her a moment beneath the shelter of the entrance while a carriage was arranged to take her home. "Thank you for staying," he said. "I know it was not what you expected of your evening." "It was not," she agreed, "but I find I am glad of it." As the carriage pulled away down the long gravel drive, Hannah looked back once at the great house behind her, its windows glowing gold against the dark, and wondered whether she would ever see it again, or whether tonight would remain a single strange and lovely hour, never to be repeated. She did not yet know how wrong that guess would prove to be. 3 days after the dinner, a cart from Vane Hall stopped outside the bakery, and the driver climbed down carrying a folded note sealed with a plain wax stamp. Hannah's father, still pale from his illness but well enough now to stand behind the counter, turned the note over in his hands before passing it to her. "It is addressed to you," he said, his eyebrows raised. "Not to me, not to the bakery, to you, by name." Hannah wiped the flour from her hands and broke the seal, aware of her father watching her closely, and of the driver waiting outside as though an answer were expected. The note was short, written in a firm, unhurried hand. "Miss Fairweather, my physician tells me the roads to the eastern farms are impassable after the rain, and there is no one at the hall who knows them as well as your father once did. I would be grateful for his advice, or failing that, for yours, since I understand you have walked those paths as often as he has. Come at your convenience. There is no urgency beyond my own curiosity. Vane." She read it twice before she trusted herself to speak. "He wants to know about the eastern roads," she said. "He says there is no urgency." Her father studied her for a long moment, then looked past her to the cart waiting outside, then back to her face again, as though he were adding up a sum that did not quite balance. "A duke does not send a cart 3 miles for advice about mud, Hannah." "Then why would he send it?" Her father did not answer that question directly. He set down the loaf he had been shaping and wiped his hands slowly on his apron, buying himself time, she suspected, though for what she could not say. "I remember his father," he said at last. "The old duke. A hard man, though fair in his way. He never once sent a cart for advice about mud. Perhaps this duke is different from his father." "Perhaps," her father said, though the word carried more weight than she liked. He was quiet a moment, then added, more gently, "You are a sensible girl, Hannah. You always have been. I only ask that you remain sensible a little longer yet." "I intend to," she said, though even as she said it, she was not entirely certain it was true. He told her to change into her better dress, the blue one kept for church, and to take her shawl, since the wind had turned colder since the rain. She caught him watching her from the doorway as she climbed into the cart, his expression unreadable, somewhere between pride and worry, and she lifted her hand to him as the cart pulled away, wishing she could promise him there was nothing to worry about at all. "You do not have to go," he had added, more quietly, just before she left, "if you would rather not." "I want to go," she had said, and was a little surprised at how true it felt, saying it aloud. The ride to Vane Hall took less time than the walk had, and this time she was shown in through the front entrance, not the servants' door, a fact the steward noted with visible discomfort as he led her to a small study lined with maps and ledgers. The Duke was waiting there already, standing at the window with his hands clasped behind him, and turned when she entered with an expression that seemed, for just a moment, unguarded. "Miss Fairweather, thank you for coming. Your note said there was no urgency, sir. Yet you sent a cart within the hour. I did not want you walking 3 miles in this wind," he said simply. "Please, sit." She sat, and for the better part of an hour they spoke of roads and farms and the flooding that came each year when the river swelled past its banks, and Hannah found herself explaining things she had never thought anyone of his rank would care to know, which fields drained badly, which bridges grew slick with moss, which farmers could be trusted to keep the roads clear and which preferred to wait for someone else to do it. He listened with real attention, asking questions that showed he had understood her answers, and made notes in a small book at his elbow. "You know this land better than my own steward," he said at last, setting down his pen. "I have walked it every week of my life, delivering bread. It would be strange if I did not know it." He smiled at that, and there was a pause after, comfortable rather than awkward, the kind that settles between two people who have run out of practical things to discuss but are in no hurry to part. You seem surprised that I would sit and listen to you at such length, she said, testing the silence a little. Should I not be? Most men of your position are not, in my experience. My father says the old steward before this one used to nod along to whatever he was told and then do exactly as he pleased regardless. Then perhaps I am simply trying not to make the same mistake twice, the Duke said. I have made a great many mistakes trusting men who told me what they thought I wished to hear. It is a relief, hearing someone tell me the truth instead, whether or not it flatters me. Was I unflattering, sir? You told me my steward is a fool who cannot read a map, he said, and there was real amusement in his voice now. I would call that unflattering, though not undeserved. She laughed despite herself, and the sound of it seemed to please him more than she expected, judging by the way his shoulders eased, the way he leaned back slightly in his chair as though something in him had been braced and could now rest. May I ask you something that has nothing to do with roads, he said. You may ask. I cannot promise a useful answer. Are you happy, baking bread with your father? The question caught her off guard, not because it was unkind, but because no one had ever asked it of her plainly before. She considered it seriously, turning the shawl over in her lap. I think so, she said finally. It is honest work. People need bread more than they need most things, and there is something good in being needed for something so simple. Though I confess I have sometimes wondered what else I might have been if my life had begun somewhere other than behind that counter. And what do you imagine you might have been? I do not know. I have never had cause to wonder for very long. Wondering does not put flour in the bin. He studied her for a moment, something thoughtful in his expression, and then rose and crossed to a shelf lined with books, running his fingers along the spines before drawing one out and setting it on the table before her. Then perhaps you should wonder a little longer than usual today, he said. Borrow this if you like. There is no urgency to return it either. She glanced at the title, a collection of essays she did not recognize, and felt an unfamiliar warmth rise in her chest, not at the gift itself, but at the plain fact that he had thought of her as someone who might want it. That is very kind, she said, though I should warn you. I read slowly. It may be some time before you see this book again. Then I shall simply have to be patient, he said, and there it was again, that small smile, the one that seemed to exist only for her. Their conversation was interrupted by a light knock at the study door, and a woman entered without waiting for a reply, dressed in an elegant walking gown of pale green, her fair hair arranged with obvious care. She stopped short at the sight of Hannah seated across from the Duke, and her expression, pleasant a moment before, cooled by several degrees. Alaric, she said, I did not know you had company. Lady Constance, he said, rising. Miss Fairweather has been advising me on the state of the eastern roads. How resourceful, Lady Constance said, her eyes moving over Hannah's blue dress with a thoroughness that made Hannah acutely aware of every seam and stitch. I did not realize the bakers of the village had become such experts in land management. There was no open insult in the words, nothing Hannah could point to directly, and yet she felt the sting of it all the same, the careful, practiced way Lady Constance had made her feel small, without once raising her voice. Miss Fairweather knows this land better than anyone in my employ, the Duke said evenly. I count myself fortunate to have her advice. Lady Constance's smile did not waver, though something behind her eyes sharpened. How fortunate indeed, she said. I only came to remind you of the assembly on Friday, Alaric. Your aunt will be most put out if you forget again. I have not forgotten. Good. She lingered a moment longer, her gaze flicking once more to Hannah, taking her in from her plain shoes to her borrowed shawl, before turning her attention fully back to the Duke, as though Hannah had already left the room. You will remember to call on my aunt beforehand, Lady Constance continued smoothly. She has been asking after you all week, and you know how she frets when she feels forgotten. I have not forgotten your aunt either, he said, a note of patience in his voice that suggested this was not the first time such a reminder had been offered. Of course you have not, she said, with a light laugh that did not quite reach her eyes. You never forget the people who matter. The words were pleasant enough on their surface, yet Hannah felt them land with a precision that could not have been accidental, a small blade wrapped in silk. She kept her expression still, folding her hands in her lap and said nothing, though she was aware of Lady Constance's gaze flicking toward her once more, brief and assessing, before returning to the Duke. I shall leave you to your roads, Lady Constance said at last, though I confess I am curious how long a discussion of mud is meant to take. We were nearly finished, the Duke said. Were you? She asked, in a tone that made it clear she did not entirely believe him, and then, with one final measured smile in Hannah's direction, She turned and swept from the room with the same practiced grace she had entered with. The silence after she left stretched a little too long. "I should go," Hannah said, rising and gathering the book he had given her. "My father will wonder where I have gone." "Of course," he said, and walked with her to the front entrance himself, waving off the steward once more. At the door he paused, as though weighing whether to say something further, and settled instead on something simpler. "Thank you for coming, Miss Fairweather. And for the roads, and for the book," she said. "Thank you for that." He hesitated at the bottom of the steps, one hand resting on the side of the cart, as though there were something more he wished to say, and could not quite find the shape of it. "Lady Constance did not mean any harm," he said finally, though the words sounded more like something he wished were true than something he fully believed. "I did not think she did," Hannah said, which was not entirely honest, though it seemed the kinder thing to say. He nodded and stepped back, and the driver clicked the horses forward before either of them could find anything further to add. Hannah watched him grow smaller through the small window of the cart, standing alone on the steps of his great house, until the drive curved and the hedges closed him from view. As the cart carried her home through the cooling afternoon, Hannah found herself thinking not of the roads or the book resting in her lap, but of the look on Lady Constance's face, the careful coldness of it, and the quiet certainty that had settled in her own chest despite it. She thought of her father's warning, spoken so gently that morning, and understood now what he had been trying, without quite saying it, to protect her from. Something had begun at that dinner 3 days ago, something she did not yet have words for, and whatever it was, she understood now that not everyone at Vane Hall would welcome it. She opened the book on her lap and traced her thumb along the edge of its worn cover, and told herself that a borrowed book and an hour of conversation about roads meant nothing more than kindness between two people who had, by chance, found each other easy to talk to. She almost believed it, the whole way home. By the second week of visits, the village had begun to talk, and Hannah knew it the way she knew when rain was coming, by the sudden quiet that fell over a room when she entered it. The Duke had taken to calling at the bakery himself now, no longer sending carts or notes, arriving on horseback in plain clothes that fooled no one, since half the village had seen his crest on the harness before he thought to leave it behind. He would linger by the counter, buy more bread than any single household could possibly eat, and find some reason to speak with her father about the state of the roads, the weather, the price of grain, questions that grew thinner and less convincing with each visit. Her father bore it with a patience that Hannah suspected cost him more than he let show. He was polite to the Duke, respectful in the way custom demanded, but Hannah caught him watching them both with a furrowed brow when he thought no one noticed, and one evening, after the shop had closed and the shutters were drawn, he finally said what had clearly been sitting on his tongue for days. "He is a duke, Hannah." "I know what he is, father." "Do you? Because from where I stand it looks as though you have forgotten it entirely, the way you smile when that bell over the door rings and it is him standing there." Hannah set down the cloth she had been using to wipe the counter, stung more by the truth of it than she wanted to admit. "I have not forgotten anything. He is kind to me. Is that so difficult to believe?" "Kindness from a man like that always has a shape to it eventually," her father said, not unkindly, but with the weariness of a man who had lived long enough to watch such things unfold before. "Either he means to make you his wife, which the whole of society will fight tooth and claw to prevent, or he means something less than that, which will cost you far more than it costs him. I do not see a version of this where you come away unhurt, and I am your father. It is my job to worry about that, whether or not it is my place to say so aloud." "I can take care of myself," she said, though her voice was not quite as steady as she wanted it to be. "I know you believe that," he said. "I only hope you are right." Neither of them spoke of it again that night, but the words sat between them for days afterward, unspoken but present, coloring every glance her father sent toward the door whenever the bell rang. The whispers reached Hannah in smaller ways too, in the market where women she had known her whole life suddenly found reasons to lower their voices as she passed, in the sideways glances of girls who had once counted her a friend, and now seemed to measure her differently, as though she had become someone worth watching rather than someone worth knowing. An old woman who sold ribbons near the church stopped her one morning and asked, with a bluntness that Hannah almost admired, whether it was true that the Duke had promised her a house of her own. "There is no truth to it," Hannah said. "He has been kind to my family, that is all." "Kindness," the woman repeated, with a knowing look that suggested she believed no such thing, and went back to arranging her ribbons without another word. Hannah walked the rest of the way home with her jaw tight and her hands curled into fists at her sides, more angry than she expected to be, not at the woman, who meant little harm, but at the unfairness of it all, that a few visits and a shared conversation about roads should be enough to rewrite the whole of who she was in the eyes of people who had known her since she was a child. The Duke, for his part, seemed entirely unaware of the trouble his visits were causing, or perhaps simply unwilling to acknowledge it. He continued to call, continued to linger, and one afternoon, finding Hannah alone in the shop while her father delivered an order across the village, he asked if she might walk with him along the river, since the weather had turned fine and he had grown tired of discussing bread over a counter. "It is not proper, sir," she said, though she was already untying her apron. "Very little about our acquaintance has been proper thus far," he said. "I do not see why we should start observing the rules now." They walked along the riverbank in the afternoon sun, the water low and clear after weeks without rain, and for a while neither of them spoke of dukes or bakers or the distance between their two lives, content simply to walk and watch the light move across the water. "You have grown quieter these last few days," he observed eventually. "Has something troubled you?" "My father worries," she admitted, since there seemed little use in hiding it. "About what people will say, about what you might want from me, and what it might cost me, if you did not mean it kindly." The Duke stopped walking, and turned to face her fully, his expression more serious than she had yet seen it. "I would never seek to harm you, Hannah. Whatever else people say of me, I hope you know that much is true." "I believe you mean that," she said carefully, "but meaning it and being able to protect me from the consequences are not always the same thing. You are a duke, I am a baker's daughter. There is no version of this that the world will simply allow to happen quietly." "Perhaps the world does not get to decide everything," he said, though there was less certainty in his voice than she might have wished for. They resumed walking, slower now, and for a while the only sound was the water moving over stones and the distant call of some bird settling in the reeds. Hannah found herself watching the Duke from the corner of her eye, the careful way he chose his steps along the uneven bank, the faint furrow that had settled between his brows since her admission about her father's worry, and wondered, not for the first time, what it must be like to carry the weight of an entire estate and title on shoulders that still seemed, in moments like this, so unguarded. "May I ask you something in return?" she said eventually. "Of course." "Were you always this lonely?" she asked. "Or is it something that grew on you gradually, the way damp grows into a wall no one thinks to repair?" He was quiet long enough that she wondered if she had overstepped, but when he answered, his voice was steady, almost relieved, as though he had been waiting for someone to ask. "I was engaged once, some years ago, to a woman my family considered a suitable match in every respect. She left before the wedding, for reasons that were explained to me only in the vaguest terms, and I spent a long while afterward believing the fault must have been mine, some deficiency I could not quite name. Since then I have found it easier to keep people at a careful distance. It is a lonelier arrangement but a safer one. I am sorry," she said, and meant it. "Do not be. I have come to think, lately, that the arrangement was never as safe as I believed it to be, only quieter." It was some time before either of them spoke again. It was Hannah who finally broke the silence, curious despite herself about a matter that had been nagging at her since the dinner weeks before. "The man who sat further down the table, at your dinner, the one who asked so many questions about my family, who was he?" "My cousin, Edmund," the Duke said, and something in his tone shifted, grew guarded. "He stands to inherit the title and the estate, should I never marry, or should I die without an heir. He has taken a great interest in my affairs since I came into the dukedom, more than I always find comfortable. Does he dislike me?" "I do not think he has decided yet whether you are worth disliking," the Duke said honestly, which, knowing Edmund, may be more dangerous than open dislike would be. She filed that answer away carefully, the way she filed away every piece of information that might one day matter, and said nothing further on the subject, though she did not forget it. A few days later, Hannah found herself at Vane Hall once more, this time at the request of Mrs. Eldridge, who had sent word asking for her opinion on a matter of provisions for the coming harvest festival, a request that struck Hannah as flimsy even as she agreed to it. She found the housekeeper in the still room, surrounded by jars of preserved fruit, her sleeves rolled to the elbow. "I do not think you asked me here about jam, Mrs. Eldridge," Hannah said, once the pleasantries had been exchanged. Mrs. Eldridge allowed herself a small, dry smile, and gestured for Hannah to sit on the stool near the window. "No," she admitted. "I asked you here because I wished to see for myself what sort of young woman had put such a light back into this house. I have worked here since before the Duke was born, Miss Fairweather. I have watched him grow from a boy who laughed easily into a man who rarely does. I wish to know why that had changed. And have you decided? I have decided you are exactly what you appear to be, Mrs. Eldridge said, which is rarer than you might think among the people who find their way into this house. That is not nothing, in a place like this. Hannah did not know quite how to answer that, so she said nothing, and Mrs. Eldridge, seeming to understand, did not press her further, only handed her a jar of preserved plums, and told her to take it home to her father, since the harvest had been generous that year, and there was more than the household could use. As Hannah made to leave, Mrs. Eldridge caught her arm gently at the door, her expression turning more serious. A word of caution, if you will permit it. Mr. Edmund Vane is not a man who loses gracefully, and he has begun to see you as something he may lose. Be careful what you say in front of him, and to whom you say it. Not everyone in this house wishes the Duke well, whatever face they wear at dinner. I will remember that, Hannah said, and meant it, carrying the warning with her the whole ride home, tucked away alongside everything else she had learned to be careful of since that first rainy evening at the gates of Vane Hall. Back at Vane Hall that same week, in a study far from the riverbank where Hannah and the Duke had walked, Edmund Vane sat with a glass of brandy he had not touched, watching Mrs. Eldridge move about the room, straightening books that did not need straightening. You disapprove, he said, without looking at her. Mrs. Eldridge did not pretend to misunderstand him. She had known Edmund Vane since he was a boy visiting for the summer, quieter than the Duke and always a half-step behind him, and she had watched that quiet harden over the years into something more calculating, though she had never once said so aloud. It is not my place to approve or disapprove of anything the Duke chooses to do, Mr. Vane. That has never once stopped you before. Perhaps not, she allowed, but I have also learned in 30 years of service when an opinion is wanted, and when it is merely being invited so that it can be dismissed. I suspect this is the latter, and yet you have an opinion, I am certain. She set down the book she had been holding and turned to face him fully, her expression unreadable, the same careful neutrality she had maintained through 30 years of service in that house. I think the Duke has been a lonely man since his engagement ended, and I think loneliness makes fools of even the wisest among us. Whether Miss Fairweather is good for him or ill for him, I could not yet say, but I have watched him at dinner these past weeks, and I have not seen him laugh so freely in a very long time. Sentiment does not preserve a title, Edmund said, nor does it satisfy the expectations of a family that has held this land for 200 years. No, Mrs. Eldridge agreed, but perhaps the Duke has grown tired of preserving things at the expense of living, Mr. Vane. It happens, to men who have spent too long doing only what is expected of them. Edmund said nothing further, but after Mrs. Eldridge had gone, he sat alone in the study for a long while, turning the untouched glass of brandy slowly in his hand, his thoughts already moving toward the question of what, precisely, could be done about a baker's daughter, who had somehow become a threat to everything he had spent years quietly waiting for. The following morning, he sent a discreet letter to an acquaintance in the city, a man known for uncovering information that respectable people preferred to keep buried, and asked, in careful and unremarkable language, whether anything at all was known about the Fairweather family, and whether anything might be found, if one looked closely enough, or paid generously enough, to prove that Hannah Fairweather was not quite so innocent as she appeared. He did not yet know what he hoped to find. He knew only that he intended to find something, and that he would use whatever he uncovered without hesitation, should the need arise. He sealed the letter with his own ring rather than the family crest, a small precaution but a deliberate one, and handed it to a servant he trusted to say nothing of where it had been sent. Then he sat by the window of his chambers and watched the lane that led toward the village, half expecting, though he could not have said why, to see the Duke riding out again that very evening, as he so often did now. Sure enough, within the hour he watched his cousin ride past the gates, unhurried, unremarkable in his plain riding coat, and Edmund felt something tighten in his chest that he did not care to examine too closely. It was not affection for the title alone that moved him, though he told himself it was. It was the particular unfairness of watching a man who already possessed everything, land and name and fortune beyond counting, reach out so easily, and take the one thing that had never once been offered to Edmund himself, a kind of easy warmth that seemed to follow the Duke wherever he went, earned or not. He finished the brandy at last, in one long swallow, and told himself that whatever came of the letter, it would only be the truth, and the truth, surely, could hurt no one who had nothing to hide. It was a comfortable thought, and he held on to it, even as some quieter part of him understood that the truth was rarely what men like him were actually after. The morning had begun ordinarily enough, with the smell of fresh loaves rising warm from the ovens and the usual rhythm of market day settling over the square. Stalls unfolding their awnings, farmers calling out the price of their vegetables, children weaving between the crowds with the particular energy of a day free from lessons. Hannah had arrived early with her father to set up their stall, glad of the routine, glad of the simple, unremarkable business of selling bread to people who wanted nothing more from her than a fair loaf and a fair price. For nearly 2 hours, the morning had gone exactly as every market morning before it had gone. She had wrapped loaves, made change, exchanged small pleasantries with neighbors who asked after her father's health, and said nothing at all about dukes or dinners or roads. She had almost allowed herself to believe that the gossip of recent weeks had begun, at last, to quiet. Then the carriage arrived, its wheels loud on the cobblestones, and Hannah looked up from the bread stall just in time to see Lady Constance stepping down, dressed in pale blue silk that seemed almost cruel in its brightness against the ordinary gray of the market day. Hannah had not expected her here. Lady Constance did not shop for herself, did not haggle over the price of eggs, or examine loaves for freshness, and yet there she was, moving through the stalls with 2 companions at her side, her attention already fixed, unmistakably, on the Fairweather bread stall. "Miss Fairweather," Lady Constance said, stopping before the stall with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "How industrious you are. I had heard you spent your mornings elsewhere these days." Hannah kept her hand steady on the loaf she was wrapping. "My mornings belong to the bakery, my lady, same as they always have." "Do they? I had heard otherwise. I had heard you spend a great deal of time at Vane Hall, discussing roads and books, and matters that seem rather beyond the scope of a baker's daughter. It is remarkable, really, how far ambition can carry a person, given the right encouragement." A small crowd had begun to gather without seeming to gather at all, the way crowds do in a market square, people pausing over apples or ribbon who had no real interest in either, drawn instead by the sharpness in Lady Constance's voice. "I do not know what you mean, my lady," Hannah said, though her voice had lost some of its steadiness. "I think you know precisely what I mean." Lady Constance's smile widened, though it grew colder as it did. "I have known the Duke a very long time, Miss Fairweather. Since before you were old enough to bake a decent loaf of bread, I should imagine. I know what kindness looks like on him, and I know what pity looks like too, and I confess I find it difficult to tell, watching you, which one you have mistaken for something more." The words landed exactly where they were meant to, sharp and public, and Hannah felt her face grow hot, felt the eyes of the gathered crowd pressing on her from every side. She thought of a dozen answers, and could summon none of them, her tongue suddenly heavy in her mouth. "Perhaps," Lady Constance continued, when there was no reply, "someone ought to remind you where you belong, before you embarrass yourself and him any further than you already have. That is enough, Constance." The voice cut across the square with an authority that silenced the murmuring crowd at once, and Hannah turned to see the Duke dismounting from his horse a short distance away, his expression harder than she had ever seen it, a coldness in his eyes that had clearly been reserved, until now, for someone other than her. "Alaric," Lady Constance said, her composure faltering only slightly. "I heard exactly what you were merely doing," he said, crossing the square in long strides that closed the distance between them before she could finish the sentence. "You will apologize to Miss Fairweather, here, in front of everyone who witnessed the insult, or you will leave this square and we will discuss the matter privately, in terms considerably less pleasant than this one." The crowd, which had been murmuring quietly a moment before, went entirely silent now, watching the exchange with the frank, unhidden curiosity of people who understood they were witnessing something that would be discussed at every dinner table in the village by nightfall. Lady Constance's face had gone pale, then flushed, her eyes darting once to the crowd and once to Hannah before settling, finally, on the Duke. "I meant no offense," she said stiffly, the words costing her something visible. "Miss Fairweather." It was not an apology, not truly, but it was enough to satisfy the letter of what the Duke had demanded, and he did not press further, though the coldness did not entirely leave his expression as Lady Constance turned and swept back toward her carriage, her companions hurrying after her, the whole procession considerably less graceful in its retreat than it had been in its arrival. For a moment, no one in the square moved. The murmur of ordinary market business had stopped entirely, replaced by a hush that felt almost physical, every eye still fixed on the Duke and the young woman standing beside the bread stall. Somewhere near the church a dog barked, breaking the spell just enough that the crowd began, slowly, to remember its own business, though the glances continued, quieter now but no less pointed. The Duke turned to Hannah, his expression softening at once, though the damage, she understood even then, had already been done. It could not be undone simply because he had defended her. If anything, his defense had only made the moment larger, more memorable, more certain to travel from mouth to mouth until the whole county had heard some version of it by week's end. "Are you unhurt?" he asked quietly. "I am unhurt," she said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "Hannah, I am sorry. I should have—" "You should have nothing, sir," she said, and heard her own voice shake despite her effort to steady it. "You did exactly what was right. That is not the difficulty." "Then what is?" She looked around at the market square, at the faces still watching them, some curious, some pitying, a few openly hostile, and felt the full weight of what her father had warned her of settle over her at last, heavier than she had let herself imagine it could be. "I am not upset with you," she said, more gently now, seeing the confusion still written plainly on his face. "I am grateful, truly, that you did not let her words stand unanswered. But do you not see what has happened here? An hour ago I was simply a baker's daughter, known to everyone in this square by name, trusted, unremarkable. Now I am a story. I am something people will speak of over supper, will wonder about, will pity or scorn depending on their temperament. And none of that will change no matter how the two of us feel about each other in private." "I cannot control what people choose to say," he said, though there was less certainty in his voice than usual. "No," she agreed, "but I must live among them, sir, in a way that you do not. You will ride back to your hall this evening, and this will be a single unpleasant incident among many you have weathered in your life. I will still be standing behind this counter tomorrow morning, and the morning after that, and every person who buys bread from me will remember what they saw today." He was silent at that, and she saw something shift behind his eyes, some recognition of a truth he had perhaps not fully considered before, the plain and unequal weight that scandal carried depending on which of them bore it. "I did not think of it that way," he admitted quietly. "Most people in your position never have to," she said, without unkindness, only tiredness. "It is not a fault in you. It is simply the shape of things. The difficulty is that this will only grow worse," she said. "Whatever I do, whatever you do, people will speak of this for weeks. My father's shop will suffer for it. My own name will be spoken of in ways I cannot control, no matter how carefully I behave. You have a title to protect, and a family name, and I have brought nothing to this but scandal, however unwillingly." "You have brought me more than that," he said, low enough that only she could hear it. "Perhaps," she said, "but it may not be enough to outweigh the cost." She did not wait for his answer. She gathered the last of the bread from the stall, called softly to the boy who helped mind it, and walked away through the thinning crowd without looking back, though she felt his eyes on her the entire distance, and felt, too, the strange ache of leaving something behind that she was not at all certain she wished to leave. That evening, at the bakery, her father found her sitting alone in the dark kitchen long after the ovens had cooled, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. "I heard what happened," he said gently, settling into the chair across from her. "Then you know I have made a mess of everything." "You have made nothing," he said. "A woman with more spite than sense made a scene in a public market, and a man who cares for you defended you against it. That is not a mess of your making, Hannah, whatever it may feel like tonight." "It does not matter whose making it is," she said. "It is happening regardless, and I do not know how to stop it." Her father was quiet a long moment, watching her with the same careful worry he had worn for weeks now. "Perhaps you are not meant to stop it," he said finally. "Perhaps you are only meant to decide whether it is worth enduring. That is a different question, and only you can answer it." She looked at him then, at the tired lines around his eyes, the flour still dusted faintly along his sleeve from the day's work, and felt a rush of tenderness for him that momentarily crowded out even her own worry. "You have never once told me what to do," she said, "even now, when you have every right to." "Telling you what to do never once worked when you were a child," he said, with the faint ghost of a smile. "I do not imagine it would work any better now that you are grown. I only want you safe and happy, in whichever order those things prove possible. The rest I leave to you." She reached across the small table and took his hand, rough with years of kneading dough, warm and familiar in a way that steadied her more than any words could have. "What would you do," she asked, "if you were me?" He considered the question seriously, as he considered most things, turning it over before answering. "I would ask myself which kind of regret I could live with better," he said finally. "The regret of having tried and having it end badly, or the regret of never knowing what might have come of it at all. I cannot answer that for you, Hannah. I have only ever had to bake bread and raise a daughter. I never once had to choose between a duke and my own good sense." Despite everything, she laughed, a small, tired sound, and felt some of the weight in her chest ease, if only slightly. "I do not know which regret I could bear better," she admitted. "Then perhaps you have not decided yet," he said gently. "There is no shame in that. Not every answer arrives on the same day as the question." They sat together a while longer in the quiet kitchen, the last of the day's warmth fading from the ovens, and though her father offered no more advice, his presence beside her was its own kind of comfort, steady and unwavering, the one certainty in a day that had otherwise upended nearly everything she thought she understood about her own life. She did not have an answer that night, only the memory of the Duke's face in the square, the coldness in his eyes when he had defended her, the warmth that had replaced it the moment he turned back to her, and beneath both, the small, persistent, frightened certainty that whatever she chose now, there would be no simple way back to the life she had lived before that first rainy evening at the gates of Vane Hall. The letter arrived at Vane Hall on a gray morning, delivered by the same discreet acquaintance Edmund had written to weeks before, and by the time the Duke sat down to breakfast, his cousin was already waiting for him in the small study, a folded paper resting on the desk between them. "You will want to see this before you eat," Edmund said, without preamble. The Duke's appetite, already modest, disappeared entirely as he read. The paper claimed, in careful and convincing detail, that Hannah Fairweather had been approached some weeks earlier by an agent representing a rival family, one with old grievances against the Vane estate, and paid a sum of money to draw the Duke's attention and manufacture a scandal that would embarrass the family publicly. It included a description of a payment, a supposed witness in the village who had seen money change hands, and a date that lined up, with troubling precision, to the very week Hannah had first delivered the cake to Vane Hall. "This cannot be true," the Duke said, though his voice lacked its usual certainty. "I did not want to believe it either," Edmund said, and had the decency, or the cunning, to look genuinely troubled as he said it. "I made inquiries only because I feared for you, Alaric. I know how easily kindness can be mistaken for something safer than it is. I did not expect to find anything at all. I certainly did not expect to find this." "Who is this witness?" "A man named Corbin, who works the stables near the Fairweather Bakery. He is willing to speak with you directly, should you wish it, though I suspect he will be cautious, given what such testimony might cost him with his neighbors." The Duke read the letter again, more slowly, searching for some flaw in its logic, some detail that did not fit, but found none that he could point to with any confidence. He thought of the market square, of Lady Constance's pointed remarks about ambition, and felt a cold, unfamiliar doubt begin to take root where certainty had stood only days before. "I want to speak with this Corbin myself," he said finally. "Of course," Edmund said, "though I would ask you to consider, before you do, what it will look like if word spreads that the Duke of Vane rode out personally to interrogate a stable hand about a baker's daughter. Perhaps it would be wiser to send someone in your place." The Duke considered this, and against his better instincts agreed, and it was Edmund himself who arranged the meeting, and Edmund who reported back, 2 days later, that Corbin had confirmed the substance of the letter entirely, describing a purse of coins and a hurried, secretive exchange near the bakery's back door. By the time the Duke rode to the bakery that afternoon, something in him had already hardened, though he told himself he was merely seeking the truth, merely giving Hannah the chance to explain herself before he judged her too harshly. She was alone in the shop when he arrived, and her face lit at the sight of him in a way that, days earlier, would have warmed him entirely. Now it only deepened his uncertainty, made him wonder whether even that warmth had been calculated from the start. "I need to ask you something, and I need the truth," he said, before she could greet him properly. Her smile faded, replaced by confusion, then concern. "Of course. What is it? Did you accept money from anyone, in the weeks before we met, to gain my attention? To manufacture a scandal against my family?" The question landed like a slap, and she stared at him for a long moment, as though waiting for some sign that he was joking, some indication that the words could not possibly mean what they seemed to mean. "Is that truly what you believe of me?" she said finally, her voice very quiet. "I do not know what to believe. I have a letter, and a witness, and a story that fits together with more precision than I would like." "Then someone has lied to you very convincingly," she said, and the hurt in her voice was unmistakable now, sharp beneath the careful control she was fighting to maintain. "I have taken no money from anyone. I did not seek you out, sir. You will recall, quite clearly I should think, that you were the one who asked me to stay for dinner. I came to deliver a cake because my father was ill. I did nothing more than that." That is precisely what a clever liar would say. The words left him before he could soften them, and he saw the exact moment they struck her, saw something close in her expression, some door that had stood open for weeks now shutting quietly and completely. "Then I do not know what else I can offer you," she said, her voice steady now in a way that felt worse than anger would have. "I have no proof of my own innocence beyond my own word, and it seems my word is no longer sufficient. Perhaps you should go, sir. I have bread to bake, and you have a family name to protect from women like me. Hannah, I did not come here wanting to believe it." "Then you did a very convincing impression of a man who had already decided," she said. "You did not ask me gently, sir. You did not say, 'Someone has told me a troubling story and I wish to understand it.' You accused me, plainly, the moment you walked through that door, before I had said a single word in my own defense. That tells me something about how thoroughly you had already made up your mind before you ever arrived." "I wanted to believe you," he said, and for a moment something raw broke through his careful composure. "I still want to." "Wanting is not the same as doing," she said quietly. "You asked me for the truth, and I gave it to you, and it was not enough. I do not know what else you imagine I could offer that would satisfy you, beyond my own word, which apparently counts for very little measured against a letter and a stranger's story." He opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again, finding no reply that did not sound, even to his own ears, like precisely the kind of doubt she had just accused him of. "I think," she went on, more tired now than angry, "that you have spent so long guarding yourself against being hurt again, that any story convincing enough to confirm your fear will always sound truer to you than anything I could say standing in front of you. That is not a fault I can fix, sir. It belongs entirely to you. Please go." He left, though every step away from the bakery felt wrong in a way he could not quite name, some instinct arguing quietly against the conclusion his mind had already reached, and he told himself that the discomfort was simply the natural cost of learning an unpleasant truth about someone he had allowed himself to trust too quickly. Hannah did not cry until the shop door had closed behind him, and she was certain her father, upstairs resting, could not hear. She sat on the stool behind the counter, her hands pressed against her face, and let herself feel, fully and without restraint, the particular grief of being disbelieved by someone she had trusted completely. Word of the confrontation did not stay contained for long. By the following day, a version of it had already spread through the village, distorted and exaggerated with each retelling, until Hannah heard whispers that she had been caught outright, that money had been found hidden in the bakery itself, that her father had known all along and said nothing. She stopped going to market. Her father took over the deliveries again, his cough not fully healed, his temper shorter than she had ever known it, though he never once raised his voice at her, only at anyone unwise enough to repeat the gossip within his hearing. Her father, when he finally learned the shape of what had happened, said little at first, only held her while she cried, and it was not until the following evening, once the shop was closed and the shutters drawn, that he spoke his mind plainly. "I did not want this for you," he said. "Not the attention, and certainly not this. But I will say one thing in his favor, painful as it is to admit. A man who did not care for you at all would not have ridden here himself to ask. He would have simply believed the letter and let you disappear from his life without a word of explanation. That he came at all tells me the fear beneath the accusation was real, even if the accusation itself was cruel. That does not make it hurt any less," she said. "No," he agreed. "It rarely does." At Vane Hall, Mrs. Eldridge watched the Duke retreat into a silence darker than any she had witnessed since the collapse of his first engagement, and found herself, for the first time in years, questioning a decision of Edmund Vane's closely enough to act on her doubt. She began quietly, asking a maid who had a cousin in the village whether anyone knew the stable hand named Corbin, and learned within a day that no man by that name had worked the stables near the bakery in over a year, having left the county entirely after a dispute over wages. She asked further, carefully, discreetly, and learned that the letter Edmund claimed to have received from a city acquaintance bore a seal unfamiliar to anyone she consulted, unlike the seals used by the several respectable inquiry agents the family had employed in years past. She did not act on suspicion alone. She had learned long ago, in 30 years of managing a household as large and complicated as Vane Hall, that accusations without proof accomplished nothing beyond making enemies of people one might later need as allies. So she gathered what she could patiently, speaking with the groundskeeper who remembered clearly that no man named Corbin had ever been employed within the estate's own stables either, and with the housemaid whose cousin worked at the posting inn where messages to the city were typically sent, who recalled a servant of Mr. Vane's dispatching an unusual number of letters in recent weeks, always sealed, always addressed in a hand the maid did not recognize. None of it, taken alone, proved anything definite. Together, it formed a pattern too consistent to dismiss as coincidence, and Mrs. Eldridge, who had watched the Duke grow from a solemn, careful boy into an equally solemn, careful man, found that pattern impossible to ignore. She brought her findings first not to the Duke, whose judgment she feared had already been too thoroughly clouded to hear her clearly, but to the family's longtime solicitor, a careful and unhurried man named Mr. Ashworth, who listened to her account with growing concern and agreed to look into the matter further, quietly, before anything was said to anyone else in the household. It took another 4 days to uncover the whole of it, 4 days in which Hannah remained in the bakery, pale and withdrawn, and the Duke remained at Vane Hall, equally withdrawn, neither of them speaking to the other, both of them, in their separate silences, more miserable than either would have admitted aloud. Mr. Ashworth's inquiries eventually led to a printer in the city who had, for a modest fee, produced the false letter at Edmund's request, along with a man paid to pose as the stable hand Corbin during the single brief meeting arranged with the Duke's messenger. The trail, once found, was neither long nor especially well hidden, the work of a man confident that no one would think to question a story that so conveniently confirmed what everyone already feared. Mrs. Eldridge brought the evidence to the Duke herself, on the 5th evening, finding him alone in his study with an untouched dinner tray beside him, and the same letter from Edmund still resting on the desk, as though he had been unable to stop returning to it. "Your Grace," she said, closing the door behind her, "I believe you have been deceived, and I believe I know by whom." He looked up slowly, and something in her expression, grave and certain, cut through the fog he had been living in for days. "Tell me everything," he said. She did, laying out each piece of evidence in careful order, the missing stable hand, the unfamiliar seal, the printer's confession under Mr. Ashworth's careful questioning, and watched the Duke's face move through disbelief, then horror, then a cold and rising fury that she had rarely seen in him before. "Edmund did this," he said, not quite a question. "Edmund did this," Mrs. Eldridge confirmed, "and you believed it, because it was easier, I think, than believing that something good had finally come to you without a cost attached." The Duke sat in silence for a long moment, his hands pressed flat against the desk, his thoughts moving rapidly through every conversation of the past week, every cold word he had spoken to Hannah in that small bakery, every hour he had spent doubting a woman who had done nothing to deserve it. "I have to go to her," he said finally, rising so quickly the chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Not tonight," Mrs. Eldridge said gently, though there was no hesitation in her own certainty. "Tonight, deal with Edmund. Tomorrow, in daylight, in front of anyone who cares to watch, you go to her properly, and you make certain there is no version of this story left for anyone to doubt." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded, some of the fury settling into something steadier, more purposeful. "What of Edmund?" he asked. "What do I do with him tonight, if not confront him outright?" "You watch him," Mrs. Eldridge said simply. "You give no sign that anything has changed. Let Mr. Ashworth finish gathering what remains to be gathered, so that when you do confront him, there is no thread left for him to argue his way out of. A man like Edmund is dangerous when cornered too early. He is far less dangerous when he believes he has already won." The Duke exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders as the shape of a plan began to settle over the raw anger still burning in him. "You have always been wiser than I give you credit for, Mrs. Eldridge. It is easier to be wise about other people's troubles than one's own," she said, with the faintest trace of a smile. "Go and rest, Your Grace, if you can manage it. Tomorrow will require a clear head, and clearer words than you have managed to find all week." He did not sleep well that night, his thoughts circling endlessly between fury at his cousin, and a deeper, more uncomfortable shame at how easily he had turned against Hannah, how quickly a single letter had undone weeks of trust built slowly and honestly between them. He rehearsed a dozen different apologies before dawn, discarding each one as insufficient, and finally rose before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, dressed without waiting for his valet, and turned toward the door with the look of a man who finally, after days of fog, knew exactly what needed to be done. 5 days had passed since the confrontation in the bakery, 5 days in which Hannah had thrown herself into work with a single-minded determination that fooled no one, least of all her father, who watched her knead dough with more force than any loaf required, and said nothing, understanding that some grief needed to work itself out through the hands before it could be spoken aloud. She had not gone near Vane Hall in that time, had not sent word, had told herself firmly each morning that whatever had existed between herself and the Duke had ended the moment he chose a stranger's letter over her own word. She had almost begun to believe it by the 5th morning. Almost. The village square was already busy with the ordinary business of mourning, when the sound of hooves on cobblestone drew every head toward the eastern road, and Hannah, standing behind the bread stall with her father at her side, felt her whole body go still before she had even fully registered who it was. The Duke rode at a pace far quicker than dignity usually allowed, and behind him, at a more measured distance, rode Mrs. Eldridge and Mr. Ashworth in a carriage that had clearly been asked to keep up as best it could. He drew his horse to a stop directly before the bakery, dismounted before it had fully settled, and crossed the remaining distance on foot, ignoring entirely the small crowd already gathering at the unusual sight of a duke racing into the village at such an hour. "Hannah," he said, and something in his voice, raw and unguarded, silenced whatever sharp response she had been preparing since the moment she recognized him. "I have nothing further to say to you, sir," she managed, though her voice wavered more than she wanted it to. "Then let me speak, and you need say nothing at all, until I am finished." Her father shifted beside her, one hand resting protectively near her shoulder, though he did not intervene, watching the Duke with an expression that had not yet decided between wariness and hope. "I was wrong," the Duke said, loud enough that the gathering crowd could hear every word, loud enough that there could be no mistaking his meaning for anyone present. "The letter was false, manufactured entirely by my cousin Edmund, who paid a man to lie and a printer to forge evidence, all because he feared losing his place as my heir to a marriage he did not approve of. There was no witness, there was no payment, there was nothing true in any of it, and I chose to believe it regardless, because it was easier than trusting the plain evidence of a woman who had given me nothing but honesty since the day we met." A murmur moved through the crowd, quiet at first, then louder, as the meaning of his words settled over people who had, only days before, repeated the very rumors he was now publicly denouncing. "I have already dealt with my cousin," he continued. "He no longer holds any place in my household or my confidence, and the truth of what he did will be made known to anyone who cares to ask, so that no shadow of doubt remains over Miss Fairweather's name. But that is not the whole of why I came here this morning." He turned fully to Hannah then, and something in his bearing shifted, the formal address of a duke giving way to something far more uncertain, far more human. "I came because I was cruel to you, when you deserved only patience, and because I doubted you, when you had given me every reason to be trusted instead. I cannot undo those days, and I will not insult you by pretending a few words this morning can erase them entirely. But I love you, Hannah Fairweather, plainly and completely, and I have known it for longer than I allowed myself to admit, even to myself, and I am asking you, in front of everyone who has ever doubted either of us, whether you will do me the honor of becoming my wife." The square had gone entirely silent, the kind of silence that seemed to hold its breath along with every person standing in it. Hannah felt her father's hand tighten gently on her shoulder, felt the weight of dozens of eyes, and found, beneath all of it, that the only face she could truly see was the Duke's, standing before her with none of the careful composure she had grown used to, only plain, unguarded hope. "You accused me of lying to you," she said, her voice steadier now, though still soft. "You said my word alone was not enough." "I know," he said. "I was wrong to say it, and wrong to believe it, and I understand entirely if that wrong is too large for you to forgive in a single morning." "It is a very large wrong," she agreed. "It is," he said. "I do not ask you to forget it. I only ask you to let me spend the rest of my life proving I have learned from it." "And if I said no?" she asked, not unkindly, but honestly, curious despite herself what answer he would give. "Then I would deserve it," he said without hesitation, "and I would not ride away angry, or think less of you for it. I would simply have to live with the knowledge that I let fear and an old wound cost me the one good thing that had come looking for me without my having to earn it first. That would be a difficult thing to carry, but it would be mine to carry, not yours to fix." "That is a fairer answer than I expected," she said. "I have had 5 days to think of little else besides fairness," he admitted. "It is remarkable how clearly a man can see his own faults, once he has lost the thing that made those faults matter." She was quiet a long moment, searching his face for the coldness that had frightened her days before, and finding none of it. Finding instead the same unguarded warmth that had first drawn her to him across a rain-soaked hallway weeks ago, when he had opened a door rather than leave her standing in the cold. "You made me a story," she said finally. "The whole village has spoken of nothing else for weeks. Then let today be the story they remember instead," he said. "Let them remember that I was a fool who doubted the finest woman I have ever known, and that she was gracious enough, despite everything, to forgive me for it. If you will have me." A small, unwilling smile had begun to tug at the corner of Hannah's mouth, and she glanced once at her father, who gave the faintest nod, as though granting a permission she had not fully asked for but clearly wanted. "You made a very public mess of asking," she said. "I thought a private apology would not undo a public accusation," he said. "It seemed only right that the correction be just as visible as the wrong." "That," she admitted, "is rather difficult to argue with." "Is that a yes?" he asked, and for the first time that morning, something like a real smile broke through his own careful composure. She stepped out from behind the bread stall, crossed the small distance between them in the hushed square, and took his offered hand, feeling the warmth of it, the slight tremor that betrayed how uncertain he had truly been of her answer, despite every careful word he had prepared. "It is a yes," she said, and the crowd, which had held its silence through the whole of the exchange, broke at last into a murmur that quickly grew into something warmer, something closer to genuine celebration, as neighbors who had gossiped cruelly only days before now pressed forward to offer their congratulations, eager, as crowds often are, to align themselves with whichever story had proven, in the end, to be the truest one. Lady Constance, who had arrived at the edge of the square just in time to witness the proposal, turned her carriage around without a word to anyone, and was not seen in the village again for the remainder of that season. Word later reached the hall that she had removed herself to relations in the north, her pursuit of the Duke abandoned entirely once it became clear that no amount of careful cruelty could unseat a bond that had survived scandal, doubt, and a very public accusation of forgery. Edmund Vane fared considerably worse. Confronted privately by the Duke that same afternoon, with Mr. Ashworth's full evidence laid plainly before him, he attempted first to deny it, then to justify it, insisting that he had acted only out of concern for the family name, a claim that satisfied no one in the room. Stripped of his place in the household and facing the very real threat of legal consequence for his forgery, he left the county within the week, his name quietly removed from conversation at every table where it had once carried weight. The Duke, though he had every right to pursue the matter through the courts, chose in the end only to ensure that Edmund would never again hold influence over the estate or its people, a mercy that Mrs. Eldridge privately considered more generous than the situation strictly warranted, though she said nothing to dissuade him from it. The village itself took longer to settle than either Edmund or Lady Constance's departures. For a week or more, the story of the Duke's public proposal was told and retold in every kitchen and market stall, each version slightly more embellished than the last, until Hannah found herself laughingly correcting details that had grown wildly inaccurate in the retelling. A stone thrown at Lady Constance's carriage in one version, a duel narrowly avoided in another. She did not mind the exaggeration nearly as much as she minded the earlier version of the story, the one where she had been the villain rather than the woman finally, publicly, believed. Mrs. Eldridge, watching from a respectful distance near the carriage, allowed herself a rare, unguarded smile as she observed the Duke lift Hannah's hand to his lips, in full view of the delighted crowd, and thought, not for the first time, that she had been right all those weeks ago, when she told Edmund that the Duke had not laughed so freely in a very long time. She had simply not expected the laughter to end, this particular morning, in quite so public and satisfying a triumph. Mr. Ashworth, standing beside her with the folded evidence still tucked safely inside his coat, allowed himself a rare comment on a matter unrelated to law. "I have drafted a great many contracts in my years of service to this family," he said quietly, "but I do not believe I have ever seen one negotiated quite so publicly, nor quite so successfully." "Some agreements are better made in the open," Mrs. Eldridge said. "It leaves less room afterward for anyone to claim the terms were unclear." The old woman who sold ribbons near the church, the same one who had questioned Hannah so pointedly weeks before, pushed forward through the crowd to offer her own congratulations, her earlier suspicion entirely forgotten in the excitement of the moment, and pressed a length of pale ribbon into Hannah's hands as a wedding gift, declaring loudly enough for half the square to hear that she had known all along there was something fine about the girl, whatever anyone else had whispered. Hannah accepted the ribbon graciously, and did not point out the contradiction, understanding that such small hypocrisies were simply the way a village made peace with having been wrong. That evening, back at the bakery, Hannah sat with her father in the quiet kitchen, the ring the Duke had given her, plain and elegant, catching the last of the evening light through the window. "I told you," her father said, not without a trace of satisfaction, "that a man who did not care would never have ridden here to ask." "You did say that," she admitted. "I am usually right about these things," he said, though the warmth in his voice undercut any real boastfulness. "I am glad, Hannah. Whatever trouble came before this, I am glad of how it has ended." "As am I," she said, and meant it fully. Her father turned the ring gently in her hand, examining the plain, elegant band with the careful attention of a man appraising fine work. "He chose well," he said, No excessive stones, nothing showy. A ring meant to be worn, not merely admired. Perhaps that is the sort of husband he means to be as well, Hannah said. One meant to be lived with, not merely admired from a distance. Her father laughed softly at that, the first easy laugh she had heard from him in days, and reached across the table to take her free hand in both of his. Whatever comes next, he said, the great house, the title, all the responsibilities that will come with wearing that ring. I hope you will remember that you are still the same girl who delivered cakes and minded this counter, and never once let a duke intimidate her into silence. That girl is the reason he loves you. Do not let the great house make you forget her. I do not think I could forget her if I tried, she said. She is rather stubborn about staying. Good, her father said. Stubborn has served you well thus far. She sat with him a while longer as the evening deepened outside the window, thinking of the rain-soaked afternoon weeks before when she had first stepped through the gates of Vane Hall expecting nothing more than to deliver a cake and return home, never once imagining that a single delayed delivery would reshape the whole of her future so completely, and so happily, in the end. Whatever trials had come between that first evening and this one, she found she would not trade a single one of them, not the scandal, not the doubt, not even the pain of Edmund's cruelty, for they had led her, each in their own difficult way, to a love that had proven in the end sturdy enough to survive being tested. The chapel bells were still ringing when Hannah stepped out into the autumn sunlight as the new Duchess of Vane, her hand resting in the crook of Alaric's arm. The whole village crowded along the lane to watch them pass, waving ribbons and calling out blessings with an enthusiasm that would have seemed impossible to her only months before, when those same neighbors had whispered behind their hands at every mention of her name. The chapel itself had been decorated simply, at Hannah's own request, with autumn leaves and late roses gathered from the estate gardens, rather than the elaborate imported blooms the household staff had first proposed. And she had insisted, too, that the village be invited alongside the more distinguished guests from the county, a decision that had raised more than a few eyebrows among Alaric's relations, but which he had defended without hesitation the moment it was questioned. My wife's family and neighbors will sit wherever they please in this chapel, he had told his aunt plainly, when she raised the matter delicately over tea, and if that arrangement troubles anyone's sense of propriety, I would remind them that propriety did very little to make me happy these past years, while honesty has managed it in a matter of months. It had been 6 months since the morning in the market square, 6 months of preparation and correspondence, and the slow, careful work of introducing a baker's daughter to a world that had, in the end, welcomed her far more warmly than either of them had once feared. Lady Constance's absence from the wedding was noted by no one aloud, though several guests exchanged knowing glances at her name's conspicuous omission from the guest list. Edmund's name was not mentioned at all, by anyone, all afternoon. Hannah's father stood near the front of the crowd, dressed in a coat finer than any he had owned before, dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief he pretended not to need. And when the ceremony had ended and the newly married couple made their way down the aisle together, he caught his daughter's eye and gave her a small, proud nod that said more than any words could have managed. The bakery itself had not closed, despite Hannah's new title, a fact she had insisted upon from the very first conversation about the wedding, over the gentle objections of Alaric's more traditional relations. I will not stop being my father's daughter simply because I have become your wife, she had told him plainly, weeks before, and he had not argued the point for long, understanding by then that arguing with Hannah rarely ended in his favor, and rarely needed to. Instead, the Duke had quietly arranged for the bakery to be expanded, a second oven installed, a young apprentice hired to ease the physical burden on her father's aging hands, and had insisted, over her father's own gentle protests, that the improvements be considered a wedding gift rather than charity, a distinction her father accepted with visible relief, since pride, it turned out, ran in the family in more ways than one. I do not need a duke's charity, her father had said stiffly, when the matter was first raised. It is not charity, Alaric had replied, with the particular patience Hannah had come to recognize as his way of handling stubbornness he respected rather than resented. It is a father-in-law's due, and I intend to see you receive it whether you thank me for it or not. Besides, a man cannot keep pace with a growing trade on a single aging oven forever, however much pride insists otherwise. Her father had grumbled about the matter for a full week afterward, though Hannah noticed he grumbled rather less once the second oven was actually installed, and had stopped entirely by the time the new apprentice, a quick and cheerful boy from a neighboring farm, had proven himself capable enough to be trusted with the early morning loaves, leaving her father time, for the first time in years, to sit in the afternoon sun, rather than stand at the counter until his legs ached. On the afternoon of the wedding feast, held in the gardens of Vane Hall under a sky clear enough to make the whole affair feel like a blessing rather than mere good fortune, Mrs. Eldridge found a quiet moment to speak with the new Duchess, away from the noise and the toasts and the endless stream of well-wishers. "I did not think, when I first met you in that still room surrounded by jars of jam, that I would live to see this day," she admitted, a rare softness in her usually composed expression. "Neither did I," Hannah confessed. "Though I confess I hoped for it, more than I let myself admit at the time." Mrs. Eldridge studied her a moment, something warm and approving in her gaze. "You have done this house a great service, Your Grace, whether or not you intended it. This family had grown quiet and careful long before you arrived, guarding itself against every possible hurt until it had very little life left in it worth guarding. You brought the noise back, the laughter. I do not think the Duke, or this household, will ever be quite so careful again, and I mean that as the highest compliment I know how to give." Hannah felt her throat tighten unexpectedly at the words, and reached out to take the older woman's hand. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything, for seeing the truth when it mattered most." "It was the least I could do," Mrs. Eldridge said, "and it was the truth I always would have found, given time. I am only glad I found it soon enough to matter." As the afternoon wore on and the guests scattered across the gardens in small clusters of conversation, Alaric found his way back to Hannah's side, 2 glasses of wine in hand, and settled beside her on a low stone bench beneath an old oak tree that had stood on the estate for longer than anyone could accurately guess. "You seem thoughtful," he observed, handing her one of the glasses. "I was thinking of the day I first came here," she admitted, soaked through, terrified of the steward, certain I would be sent away before I ever saw the inside of the house. "I did not imagine, standing in that rain, that it would lead to this." "Neither did I," he said, "though I confess, the moment I saw you standing there, drenched and furious and entirely unwilling to be intimidated by my own steward, I suspected my quiet, careful life was about to become considerably less quiet." "Do you regret it?" she asked, half teasing, half genuinely curious even now. He set down his glass and took her hand instead, turning it over gently to examine the plain gold ring now resting alongside the one he had given her in the square months before. "Not for a single moment," he said. "I spent years after my first engagement convinced that safety was the only sensible thing left to want from life. You taught me otherwise, without ever once trying to. I do not think I could go back to that quiet, careful version of myself now, even if I wished to. I am not entirely certain I would recognize him anymore." "Good," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder as the late afternoon light slanted golden through the branches above them. "I rather prefer this version." "As am I," he said quietly, and the 2 of them sat together beneath the old oak tree, watching the wedding guests move through the gardens below, the whole of Vane Hall alive with warmth and noise and laughter in a way it had not been for years, and would not, if either of them had any say in the matter, ever grow quiet in that particular way again. Later that evening, once the guests had gone and the gardens had fallen quiet at last, Hannah stood at the window of the room that had once belonged to the Duke's mother and now belonged, in every meaningful sense, to her, looking out over the grounds where a rain-soaked delivery had once turned into an unexpected dinner invitation, and then into so very much more. She thought of her father, settling into his newly expanded bakery with his young apprentice, proud and stubborn and utterly unwilling to stop working even now, though she suspected the extra rest had done him more good than he would ever admit aloud. She thought of Mrs. Eldridge's quiet loyalty, steady through every difficulty, and Mr. Ashworth's careful diligence, which had uncovered the truth when it mattered most, and even, briefly, of Edmund and Lady Constance, wherever they had gone, and found she could think of them now without bitterness, only a distant, settled gratitude that their cruelty, in the end, had failed to accomplish what it set out to do. She thought, too, of the ribbon the old woman near the church had pressed into her hands that morning in the square, the same woman who had once questioned her so pointedly, and smiled faintly at the memory, understanding now, with the clarity that only distance could provide, that people were rarely as simple as their worst moments made them appear, herself included, and that forgiveness, offered generously enough, tended to return to a person eventually, in one form or another. The candles in the hallway behind her had been lit for the evening, their light spilling warm across the polished floor where, months before, she had stood dripping rainwater onto stone, uncertain and afraid, wondering whether she belonged in a house so far removed from everything she had known. She understood now that the question had never truly been about belonging in the house at all. It had only ever been about whether she would allow herself to belong beside the man who lived in it, and she was glad, deeply and simply glad that she had found the courage to answer that question honestly, even when honesty had cost her more than she expected. Alaric joined her at the window a few minutes later, wrapping an arm gently around her shoulders, and together they watched the last of the evening light fade over the grounds of Vane Hall. Two people who had begun as nothing more than a duke and a baker's daughter, and had become, through scandal and doubt and the slow, patient work of trust, rebuilt something far more lasting than either of them had once dared to imagine possible. Whatever the future held, Hannah thought, leaning into his shoulder as the stars began to appear above the darkening gardens, it would hold it together, and that, more than any title or fortune or grand house, was the only inheritance she had ever truly wanted.